You'll walk out of this trial with nothing." Bryce said it with so much smug confidence that I had to wonder who he thought he was. Even before his lawyer opened his mouth, Bryce already believed my fate was a done deal. From the way he looked at me in that conference room, I was just the clueless woman who signed whatever was put in front of her. Something he was about to toss aside, and he wanted to make sure I felt grateful for it. What he didn't know was that sentence marked the beginning of his fall. It was the moment people realized a man can be sharp at work, yet blindly confident he has his wife under control at home. To understand why I sat in that lawyer's office with a face colder than Bryce ever expected, we have to rewind 6 years. Back to where it all started, at a company party I never even planned to attend. That night, I was standing in a corner of the room, trying to take in the atmosphere and find a little inspiration for the interior design work I'd always loved. I wasn't the loud type. I liked watching more than talking. I'd always felt drawn to the subtle things, where the light falls, which colors bring a sense of calm, how a space can tell the story of the person living in it. That's what caught Bryce's attention. He walked over, stood beside me, and said I was the only person at the party who wasn't trying to be noticed. Back then, I thought it was a compliment. But later I realized he didn't like independent women. He liked silence because he thought it was easy to control. Bryce worked in finance, a man who loved power so much that every conversation felt like he was presenting the results of a successful deal. He was charming, confident, and had a way with words that made people believe he always knew exactly what he was doing. At the time, I didn't see anything wrong with it. No one sees the dark side of confidence until it turns into control. The early signs showed up fast. On our first few dates, Bryce kept asking how much I made. I thought he was just curious. But the question came up again and again in a way that started to unsettle me. Then came the talk about bank accounts. He said, "Let's combine them. It's easier to manage. In a relationship, one person should handle the money." I was too young to see that the easy part only applied to him. I kept working. I still had my own clients, still spent hours on sketches that made me feel like I had worth. But Bryce didn't like that much. He said my job was unstable, and if I loved him, I should let him take care of things. I didn't argue. I just stayed quiet and kept doing the work that made me feel like myself. But that silence made Bryce think I agreed with everything he wanted. A year after we got married, he started dismissing my work more openly. Things like, "You just do it for fun, right?" Or "I make more than enough for both of us." I'd listen without reacting, not because I was scared, but because I was trying to study the man I'd chosen. I've always believed that when someone is put in certain situations, their true nature shows. Bryce was starting to show his. Then the paperwork happened. It was a weekday afternoon. Bryce handed me a stack of documents, set a pen on the table, and said, "Sign this. It's just an ownership adjustment to make taxes easier." I didn't understand much about financial details. I worked with colors, materials, the structure of a space, not legal numbers. I asked him a few questions. Bryce smiled in that gentle way I now know was fake. "Trust me, I've got it." I signed, not because I trusted him, but because I didn't yet have a reason to doubt him. But one small moment snapped me awake. After I signed, Bryce grabbed the paper so fast it looked like he was afraid I'd read anything else on the page. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to tell me something wasn't right. I didn't say anything that day. I didn't ask more. I didn't try to dig into it. But that feeling stayed somewhere inside me for years. A quiet warning, a small sound in an otherwise silent room. And that stack of papers I signed, the one Bryce thought I forgot about, later became his biggest mistake. It was like he'd handed me the key to the part of himself he tried hardest to hide. After the day I signed those documents, I never got to read properly. Things between us didn't fall apart right away. They just shifted in a slow, smoldering way. Like a room I once thought was peaceful, but the walls had been rotting from the inside for years. I just hadn't touched the right spot yet to see it crumble. Bryce started talking about how I should quit my job. He said it gently, almost like he cared. "I can take care of both of us. You don't need to wear yourself out with those small projects anymore." The way he said "small" made me want to push back, but I stayed quiet. I knew he wasn't asking for my opinion. He was making a decision. I tried to keep my old rhythm, meeting clients, sketching, working in the little studio I rented with a friend. But every time I mentioned a client meeting, Bryce looked irritated. He didn't forbid it, but his eyes said I was neglecting the family. I realized I'd started reporting every hour of my day, something I had never done before. As time passed, Bryce grew colder. Some nights he barely said a word. If I asked what was wrong, he'd answer in a tone that made me feel unreasonable right away. "You're too sensitive. I'm just tired." I heard that line so many times I started wondering if maybe I really was too sensitive. That's how gaslighting works. Not loud, not explosive, just small comments that make you question yourself. But my doubt about Bryce only grew. I started noticing strange charges in our joint account. The amounts weren't big enough to draw real attention, but they didn't match anything Bryce told me. He had a different excuse every time I asked gently. Client dinner, work expenses, wrong charge. Without proof, I couldn't say anything. But my instincts weren't as wrong as Bryce thought. One time, while sorting his receipts because he said he needed them for tax filings, I found a bill from an expensive restaurant. I remembered that day clearly. I'd been at the studio late, and Bryce said he was out having dinner with a business partner. But the receipt showed only 2 people. No names, no long list of drinks, no signs of a work meal, just 2 intimate dinners. I stared at the receipt longer than necessary. Then I folded it and put it back exactly where it was, as if I'd never seen it. I didn't say anything. But from that day on, I started saving everything. Emails, texts, receipts, banknotes. I took photos of any document tied to our finances, not because I thought I'd ever need to use them, but because I wanted to know the truth. Bryce had no idea. He thought I was still living in the world he built for me, someone who only trusted, only listened, only nodded. But the thing that hurt me most wasn't the receipts or the coldness. It was the night Bryce humiliated my work in front of his friends. We were sitting at a small dinner table after a conference event. People asked about my job. I was talking about a renovation project I was really proud of when Bryce cut in. "Tessa just does little decorating jobs, nothing major." His voice was light and cold, and it was enough to make the whole table shift to another topic. Bryce didn't look at me. He kept drinking like he'd said something completely normal. I sat there listening to their conversations, but it felt like someone had pressed a palm hard against my chest. I didn't get angry. I just felt something inside me drop and shatter into pieces. That night, I went home early. I sat in my workspace, looking at the sketches I hadn't finished. I didn't cry. I just saw the truth more clearly. Bryce never saw me as his equal. And what he was doing wasn't temporary, it was who he was. In the weeks that followed, Bryce pulled away even more. He came home late, said work was stressful, didn't want to talk. Whenever I tried to say anything, he'd twist it until I felt like I was the problem. "Tessa, you're blowing everything out of proportion. Why do you always want to start something? It's not my fault if you feel insecure." The most subtle gaslighting is when someone talks like they're caring about you. Then one evening, Bryce came home very early. He sat on the couch like he was about to make an announcement. No softness, no avoidance, just coldness. Cold enough that I knew right away what was coming wasn't an apology. "I want a divorce," Bryce said, his voice firm and clipped like he was finalizing a deal. I looked at him, waiting for him to continue. "We're not compatible. You don't meet my expectations. But I'll let you walk away clean if you behave." If you behave. I remember that moment clearly. Not because it shocked me, but because I saw the truth in his eyes. He still thought he controlled everything. The finances, the house, the joint account, the papers I'd signed. He thought he could keep giving orders even as he walked out. I didn't say anything. I just watched him. And when Bryce stood up, grabbed his phone and texted someone with that relieved look on his face, I knew there was someone else. And I knew something else too. Bryce had just opened a door he wouldn't be able to close. After the night Bryce said he wanted a divorce and walked out of the house with a look of relief that honestly scared me, I didn't sleep. Not because I was hurt, but because every piece from the past few years suddenly fit together too perfectly. All his silence, the receipts that didn't make sense, the comments I swallowed because I thought I was being sensitive, and the stack of papers I'd signed. I knew I couldn't stay still anymore. The next morning, I called Lawson. Lawson was an old college friend, someone I'd always respected for how calm and precise he was about everything. We didn't keep in close touch, but he was the only person I trusted to help me see this clearly. When he heard my voice, Lawson didn't ask many questions. He just told me to bring everything I'd been suspicious about. We met at his office. I set the stack of papers on the table. Lawson opened them page by page, not rushing. He looked at them like he was reading a map leading to the place I'd been dragged to for years without realizing it. After a while, he looked up. "Tessa, do you know what these papers mean?" I shook my head. I had a guess, but I wanted to hear it from someone who actually understood. "Bryce moved most of your shared assets into a secondary account you don't have access to. And these transactions don't make sense. There are recurring transfers every month, but they're not regular household payments." He turned the laptop toward me so I could see it clearly. The recipient's name wasn't shown, but Lawson zoomed in on a small note in the payment details. An internal banking code, usually used for personal expenses that aren't family-related. "Tessa, I think he's been spending money on another woman." I didn't react. I didn't slam the table or ask why. I just stared at the numbers, empty, calm, clear, cold. I don't know how long I stayed silent, but Lawson was the one who broke it. "You should prepare yourself for the possibility that this has been going on for a while." "How long?" I asked. "Maybe 3 years. 3 years. That was the first twist. Bryce had been cheating for 3 years. I didn't feel the pain I thought I would. It felt more like I'd been standing too far from the truth, and now I was just adjusting my eyes to finally see it. All the things I thought were random lined up into a straight path. 3 years isn't a mistake. It's a choice, but Lawson wasn't finished. "There's something else." He pointed to a section in the stack of papers I'd signed years ago. "Do you see this clause? It shifts the ownership of the property and part of your investment assets to Bryce under something called temporary authorization. But in reality, it's not temporary. You signed over control." I looked at that line. Just one sentence. Short, cold, but enough to show me Bryce had been planning this from the start. This was the second twist. Bryce used that paperwork to strip me of my ownership. I wanted to say something, but my throat was too dry for words. Not because I was panicking, I was organizing everything in my mind. Every small hurt I'd brushed aside was now evidence. Every tiny gaslighting moment was now a sign. Bryce hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, he'd betrayed me in the ways he knew would cost me the most. I sat up straight. "Lawson, I want to know what I can do." He pushed the stack of papers back toward me. "First thing, Tessa, you need legal evidence, not guesses. Not feelings. Documents, emails, bank records, receipts. Gather as much as you can, but it has to be done legally." "I can do that." Lawson looked at me for a long moment, like he was checking whether I was breaking without realizing it. But maybe he saw it too. I wasn't the woman who'd stayed quiet for years anymore. That night, Bryce didn't come home. Part of me felt relieved that I wouldn't have to hear another empty gaslighting line. I sat in my workspace, opened my laptop, and started digging through old emails. I downloaded copies of every receipt from the joint account. I examined every transaction. I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. I just worked, like it was a project that required absolute precision. A few days later, I remembered the secondary account Lawson mentioned. Bryce always assumed I wasn't tech-savvy, but he forgot I designed spaces, and designers notice what other people overlook. On his phone, there was a financial app he kept inside an unlabeled folder. The first time I saw it, I thought it was just an investment tracker. But now I knew it was more than that. I didn't have the password. But there was one thing Bryce never changed: his late mother's birthday. I'd seen the date once in an old email he'd sent me. I tried it. The app opened. Inside the account was a list of major expenses: hotel bills, flights, restaurants, recurring charges. And then I saw the thing that made me stop for a few extra seconds. 2 travel tickets to a coastal city during the exact week Bryce said he needed time to reflect on himself. When I looked at the date, all I thought was, of course. Of course it was. I took screenshots, saved them, moved them to a USB drive, no shaking, no anger, just facts. But what truly woke me up wasn't the travel tickets. It was a small detail at the bottom of the account. An investment Bryce had closed early. The amount was labeled internal loss coverage. I sent the screenshot to Lawson. About an hour later, he called back, his voice completely different from usual. "Tessa, this isn't just about an affair or hiding assets. Bryce used joint funds to cover an investment loss he wasn't allowed to cover. If this comes up in court, he's in serious trouble." I leaned back in my chair and let that truth sink in. Bryce hadn't just betrayed me. He'd pushed himself to the edge of a cliff he thought he'd never fall from. And all this time, he believed I wasn't smart enough to see it. In that moment, I realized the clearest thing of all. I'd been gaslit for so long that he forgot I'd always been watching. and he had badly underestimated the woman he thought he controlled. I didn't confront Bryce. I didn't say anything. I didn't change my attitude. I didn't let him see a single sign that I knew. I kept the same quiet demeanor he was used to. I kept my answers short. I stayed in the weaker role. That silence was exactly what made Bryce completely careless. While he was busy thinking he'd already won, I was quietly putting every piece of evidence exactly where it needed to be. I was getting ready. And Bryce had no idea that his biggest mistake wasn't even the affair. Since the moment I discovered Bryce had used our joint money to cover an unauthorized loss, I never looked at him the same way again. Not with resentment, but with the cold clarity of someone who has watched a mask fall off completely. I stayed silent. Bryce still believed I knew nothing. And that belief only made his true nature show even more. During the days leading up to the trial, Bryce signed papers, met with his lawyer, and walked around the house as if it were his personal stage. Whenever he got the chance, he'd throw out another threat, like he wanted me to break before I ever had the chance to stand tall. "You're nothing without me. You're walking out of here with nothing, Tessa. Don't kid yourself. You should be grateful I'm even trying to end this cleanly." I listened but didn't respond. My silence made Bryce think I was scared. In reality, I was watching every move he made to know exactly what I needed to do next. The more arrogant a person is, the more careless they become. Then, Bryce started showing up with that woman, not hiding it anymore. The first time I saw them standing together was right outside the house, when he brought her over so he could grab a few things. She looked at me with the eyes of someone who thought she'd won, and Bryce rested his hand on her waist like he was putting on a show. I stood on the stairs looking down. No jealousy, no pain. Just a clear truth. Bryce was trying to push me down so he could feel taller. "She'll understand her place soon enough," Bryce said to the woman, loud enough for me to hear. I simply turned back into my room. The door closed without a slam, but I knew that quiet was more irritating to Bryce than any argument could ever be. During that time, Lawson kept helping me behind the scenes. He didn't talk to me like I needed pity, and he didn't hype me up. He just laid out every step, every document, every piece of evidence that needed to be solid. The evidence file kept getting thicker. Regular money transfers to that woman. 2-person travel tickets, hotel receipts, signs of financial misconduct, documents proving I'd been tricked into signing over ownership. Each page was a piece of the truth Bryce never thought would come to light. Bryce didn't suspect a thing. He was too busy bragging about his early victory to his friends, too busy showing off to his mistress, too busy talking like a man who had everything under control. One time, when we were sitting and waiting for his lawyer to come over to prepare the paperwork, Bryce looked at me and said, "Tessa, let me be direct. You're just someone who lived off me. The court will see that immediately. So don't make this harder than it needs to be. I can be generous, but don't test me." I looked up at him for just a second. My eyes were cold enough to make Bryce pause, but he still thought it was a weak reaction. "Are you finished speaking?" I asked, my voice so steady it made him frown. "You're giving me attitude now? I just want to know so I don't miss anything you think you have the right to say." Bryce paused for a second, then let out a smug laugh. "You'll see. The court doesn't side with people like you." His lawyer arrived right then, pulling the conversation in another direction, but Bryce kept the same arrogant attitude from start to finish. While he was busy saying I would end up with nothing, Lawson and I were finalizing every last detail. Not to get petty revenge, but to give the truth a chance to speak for itself. The night before the hearing, I couldn't fall asleep right away. Not because I was scared, but because one question kept circling in my mind. Was I becoming another version of Bryce? Someone who only wanted to win? I sat in my workspace, the dim light falling over old sketches. I touched them. The pieces that once represented who I was before Bryce tried to smother it. I realized I wasn't like him. I didn't want to destroy him out of hatred. I wanted everything to be clear, right and wrong laid out plainly. I wanted the fairness I deserved. When I stood up, I'd already made my choice. I would do what was right, not what was cruel. And that choice was the reason I could still hold on to myself while Bryce had lost his a long time ago. The next morning, Bryce walked into the lawyer's conference room with his usual demeanor, arrogant, triumphant, confident to the point of being untouchable. He stood in front of me with his back straight, like he was facing an employee beneath him. Then he said the sentence that started it all. "You'll walk out of this trial with nothing." I looked him in the eyes. No shaking, no bowing. "You got confident a little too fast," I said quietly, but clear enough for him to hear every word. The moment Bryce frowned, it was probably the first time he sensed something wasn't lining up the way he expected, but he brushed it off right away, convinced everything was still arranged exactly how he wanted. Lawson arrived shortly after, holding the stack of documents we'd spent weeks preparing. He set it on the table, thick, heavy, solid. Bryce glanced at it but kept his usual smirk. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. I just needed patience. When the opposing lawyer started reviewing our documents, Bryce leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, as if he were waiting for a moment of triumph. But he didn't know. The most important piece of evidence, the one that could actually make him freeze, was still in my bag. Last night, I'd printed it separately. A transfer receipt from our joint account to her private card. The only receipt with an official bank stamp showing the exact account it came from. An account under both Bryce's name and mine. Bryce exposed this last month when he rushed a payment and didn't switch accounts in time. He thought I didn't understand those numbers. He thought I wasn't looking. He thought I was still the woman who only nodded when he told me to sign. That receipt wasn't the only evidence, but it was the one Bryce couldn't defend, couldn't twist, couldn't blame on anything else. And it was the final piece I needed to finish my preparation. I set the file on the table. I sat up straight. I didn't look at Bryce anymore. But I knew, just a few more hours, and he would finally understand where he went wrong. And that mistake wasn't in the numbers. It was in believing I would never stand up. The hearing took place on a cold morning. Not too dark, not too bright, just clear enough for everything to kind of focus. Bryce walked into the courtroom with that familiar confidence on his face. His eyes swept past me like someone who believed he'd already won long ago. I just sat there, my hands loosely clasped together. No shaking, no avoiding him. When the session began, Bryce's lawyer quickly shaped the narrative in his favor. He said I hadn't contributed anything to the household, that every expense, every savings account, every investment had been carried by Bryce, that I had only done small things around the house. I listened to every word without a change in expression. With each sentence, Bryce leaned forward, as if he were enjoying the moment I was being torn apart in public. Tessa has no significant financial role, Bryce's lawyer concluded, so she has no rightful claim to the assets. Bryce looked at me with a victorious stare. In that moment, I understood why he was so arrogant. He truly believed I had nothing. Lawson stood only when invited. He didn't speak long, not dramatically. His voice was calm, as if everything had already been plotted out in a clear equation. Your Honor, before we discuss contribution, Lawson began, I'd like to present a set of documents that show the truth about how the joint assets were used. I saw Bryce tilt his head slightly. Just a little, but it was the first sign of worry he couldn't hide in time. Lawson began placing each piece of evidence on the table. First were the emails and receipts, recurring consistent transfers made to the card of a woman who had nothing to do with the family, restaurant bills, hotel invoices, two-person travel tickets. The courtroom seemed to pause for a beat. Next, Lawson presented the documentation of unauthorized investments. Losses covered with money from the joint account. Financial notes Bryce had tried to hide by shifting things internally, but he couldn't erase the original logs. Bryce tightened both hands under the table. He was still trying to stay composed, but I could see the muscles in his face pull tighter, bit by bit. Then Lawson placed the stack of papers I had signed years ago onto the table. This document, Your Honor, was signed under misleading guidance. Tessa was asked to sign without the content being properly explained. This set of papers was then used to transfer ownership in a non-transparent manner. Bang! Like a blade striking straight through Bryce's final layer of defense. His lawyer tried to argue back, but the foundation was already gone. Bryce began to show the chaos brewing inside him. He looked around as if searching for someone to take his side, but his family in the back row no longer had the proud look they once carried. His colleagues avoided eye contact, and his mistress didn't show up at all. Bryce's breathing grew heavier by the minute. He tried to interrupt his lawyer, tried to explain, tried to say I misunderstood. But every time he opened his mouth, Lawson placed another document on the table to counter him. All of them carried Bryce's own signature, impossible to deny. When the court demanded order, Bryce finally stopped talking. Not out of respect, but because he was starting to see his own ending take shape. After a brief recess, the judge returned and read the verdict. His voice was steady, firm, without emotion. The court rules. Tessa is granted a fair share of the assets based on her contributions and the evidence of Bryce's misconduct. Bryce must compensate for the financial damages caused by his improper use of joint funds. The infidelity is acknowledged and directly impacts the division settlement. I heard each word sink into the cold air of the courtroom. Not excitement, not relief, just calm. As if this wasn't a victory, but simply the final map of the truth being turned the right way up. Bryce sat frozen for a few seconds. Then he turned to me with a hatred he couldn't hide. But what destroyed him wasn't me. It was the fact that he'd just lost everything he believed would always be on his side. Money, reputation, power. The consequences came faster than he expected. His company launched an investigation into the financial misconduct. His family walked out of the courtroom without saying a word. His friends avoided standing near him. And the woman he thought would stand with him in this moment left only one short message. I don't want to be involved in this. Bryce left the courthouse like a shadow. No one looked at him the way they used to. No one saw him as the winner anymore. I stepped out a few minutes after him. Not rushing, not turning back to see any trace of him. The courthouse doors opened and the midday light washed over the steps. I stood there for a moment and took a deep breath, not to steady myself, but to feel the ending clearly. I chose myself, not with shouting, not with loud revenge, but with the truth, the one thing Bryce never thought would turn against him. As I stepped off the final stair, I knew my life had turned a new page. He wanted me to walk away with nothing, I thought. In the end, he's the one who ended up that way. This is where the story ends. Thank you for staying with Tessa's journey until the very last moment, a journey sharp, clear, and full of strength. What do you think about the way Tessa chose to stand back up? If it were you, what would you have done in her place? If you enjoy psychological stories about marriage, love, and self-rediscovery like this, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. See you in the next story.